You probably associate the idea of torture with medieval times or other past periods of our history. However, this isn't always the case, because torture is still happening today. These are 5 torture methods that are still being used around the world. Number 5. Waterboarding. Waterboarding is a typical torture method used by the American government for interrogating terrorists. The subject is strapped to a slightly declined bench, while the interrogator holds a piece of cloth that's tightly wrapped around the prisoner's face. Then the interrogator begins pouring water on the prisoner's mouth for about 50 seconds. After 50 seconds pass, the prisoner gets a few seconds to take a deep breath. The whole process is then repeated multiple times. At the first glance, it may not look that brutal, but people who went through this form of torture claim that the torture feels like you are dying, that the oxygen deprivation can even cause permanent brain damage. Number 4. Tucker telephone. Even though this torture method is officially not being used by the government nowadays, I'll include it in this list because it was still being officially used until just a few decades ago. This torture device was created at the Tucker State Prison Farm, and it was used on prisoners there. It's made from old-school crank telephones. The ground wire of the telephone was attached to the prisoner's big toe, and the wire which was sending the current was attached to the prisoner's genitals. Then the torturer began cranking the phone, which sent out current. Besides causing tremendous pain, it also caused permanent organ damage and insanity. Number 3. Syrian Box Torture. This torture method is used by the Syrian government against rebel groups and is the perfect combination of physical and psychological torture. The victim is placed in a tiny wooden or metal box with his hands and feet tied up. The box is so small that the person has to be squeezed in there and has to lie in extremely uncomfortable positions. The box is also tilted, so every time food is dropped into the box, it just rolls to the bottom, and the tortured person isn't even able to get to it. Captured rebels have to stay in this box for up to a week. By this time, the food is rotten, which makes the whole experience even worse. Number 2. White torture. This is a purely psychological torture method. You may think it sounds like something that is easy to handle, but don't be fooled. White torture consists of a prisoner being placed in a completely white room with no windows. He is fed only white rice on a white plate. Guards wear special footwear to muffle any sound, which causes total sense deprivation. The combination of all these factors makes victims go crazy and break emotionally. One journalist who went through this form of torture claims that even after being released, he still doesn't feel free. Number 1. Tiger bench. This form of torture is still being used by the Chinese government against practitioners of a spiritual movement called Falun Gong. Victims are sat on a bench with their hands tied behind their backs. Their feet are elevated and placed on a few bricks, which puts the victims in a very uncomfortable position. Then, the torturer tightly wraps the victim's knees, calves, and upper thighs to the bench with a few straps. The straps press on the elevated legs of the victim until they snap. But usually, the victim's legs snap sooner than the straps. Do you think you'd be able to handle getting tortured by any of these methods? If so, comment below and let me know.